Welcome everyone to the 50th Strang Group of King's College London. I'm the director, John Davis. What a treat we've got tonight. One of our number, Jack Brown, third book launch in 2 years, I think. He's getting old hat, but it's great pride, as you can imagine, for me personally to be introducing this. So tonight we're here to launch Jack's new polemic, The House Curiosity, the London Problem, What Britain Gets Wrong About Its Capital City. I can recommend it, read it earlier. It does fit in the pocket. It's wonderful. Lots and lots of fascinating thoughts and viewpoints and touch points all the way through this book. I understand that on the House website, you can get it right now for 15% off for only £6.79 with the code London. So don't forget that, the code London. I can highly recommend it. What can I say? Jack, in a very short time, has become an authority on the history and governance of London. He did his PhD on the creation of Canary Wharf. He's got one of the great, I think, postgraduate modules, 10 weeks on the history and governance of London, that often has the Mayor of London actually taking part in it, and has recently co-authored London's Mayor at 20. And personally, I think he's one of the finest young academics in the country. So it's my great pride to be here this evening. We're also delighted that the respondent this evening is Catherine McGuinness, Chair of the Policy and Resources Committee of the City of London Corporation, and dare I say, a great friend to King's College London. Over the next hour, Jack's going to talk for about 20 to 25 minutes on the different ideas in the book, and Catherine will be respondent. And then if you use the question and answer functionality, we will get through as many as we can, hopefully finishing bang on 7, unless there is a tsunami of great questions that need a few minutes over. Without further ado, I hand over to Jack. Jack, tell us all.
I will tell you all very gladly, John. Thank you for such a warm introduction. I liked very much of what you said. I endorse it wholeheartedly. But I'm very honoured to be giving the 50th Strang Group. Been involved with the Strang Group for a very long time, before it was the Strang Group even. So it's a real honour and a privilege, and I'm very, very thankful for you for having me this evening. As John said, this book is part of Peter Hennessy initiated series, actually, of short polemics called The House Curiosities. It is wonderfully small. I'm going to wave it around doing my John McDonnell impression. It just so happens to be a little red book, but it is not that little red book. These are meant to be sort of political pamphlets on contemporary issues. I wrote about something that's of great interest to me and something I've done some work with previously with Centre for London. But I still ended up with sort of 200 plus footnotes. I'm afraid I am a bit of an academic still. And in keeping with that tradition, I'm afraid I'm going to show you some slides just to discuss some of the main themes of the book, and hopefully in a kind of positive way set us up for a really interesting Q&A. Obviously, also very grateful to Catherine for joining us today. So, what's the book about? Well, I think I can sum it up in these two quotes, which I used at the beginning of the book, somewhat provocatively, perhaps somewhat unfairly, I must say. But I wanted to understand the distance between these two quotes. Dr. Johnson's very famous, slightly arguably overused phrase, when a man is tired of London, he is tired of life, for there is in London all that life can afford. Slightly gendered language, apologies for that, it's of its time. But this idea that London has all that you could wish, it draws people from then around the country, now around the world. And it's this incredible melting pot of ideas and culture and intellect. Contrast this with the quote below, which, to be fair, was said to journalists in order to try and get them out of the way. Get out of London, go and talk to people who are not rich Remainers. I think we've kind of flipped the idea on its head here. London is actually a bubble, and the real world, culture, etc., is outside. And I wanted to kind of explore how you go between those two ideas. London as a centre of everything, and then London as a place that doesn't really get it, that doesn't really understand. So it's the distance between these two quotes that I am exploring. I am going to show you some maps. I spent a bit of time on the ONS website, because, as I like to do, I'm afraid to say. I've got this wonderful tool where you can look at regional economics. And what we've got here on the left is how much public sector revenue is generated in different regions. And London is darkest because it is the region that generates the most. It's about 30% of the population, 25% of the economy, just under. About a third of all taxes raised in London. I'm picking on Wales there with the numbers just because it was the least. I'm showing you the gap between the most and the least contributing, not because I dislike Wales, very fond of Wales. On the right here is what's known as the net fiscal balance. That's the difference between how much tax is raised in an area and how much public spending it receives in return. London and its surrounding regions, the only part of the country that pay in more than they receive in public spending. So incredible concentration of wealth, important to the UK economy. Investment elsewhere is paid for with taxes raised in London. Great, what's not to like? There is also this is also true, two things true at the same time. London receives notably more in terms of capital expenditure, or did in 2019. This is generally on things like infrastructure to generate the big tax revenue that I mentioned in the previous slide, but it does get a lot of money in return. Again, pays in more than it receives, but both figures are high. In terms of public sector expenditure, which is a much sort of broader and includes things like welfare, London does receive a lot, although the gap is perhaps a little bit less extreme. So it gets a lot of money as well as putting a lot more in. And so you can understand why there is an issue to some extent and why successive governments have tried to address this. Now, I've picked these pictures up from a film called Newtown, which is, you can find on the BFI website. It's a lovely little film promoting the new towns. Charlie, who's in the corner here on his bike, he's in a horrible congested city, which I think is London, with these dark masses of people pouring into the buses, the congested, dirty city, and eventually they'll fly away. It's that image in the centre at the bottom there, off to the new towns. There is a long history of London's performance and the South East's economic performance pulling away from the rest of the country. But at least since the 1930s, particularly in the post-war years, successive governments have been trying to address this. So it's kind of a myth or a misunderstanding to say that governments have successively ignored the rest of the country and favoured London. There have been constant attempts to do something about it. It just doesn't necessarily work. In the post-war period, very active interventionist regional policy, investing elsewhere, providing incentives for businesses to invest elsewhere, building factories directly, building the new towns, which were about depopulating the cities, moving people out of city centres, congested city centres, out into new satellite towns. Similar thing was done for business. Incentives were given for businesses to set up elsewhere, and it was even banned. Office development in central London was banned at one point in the post-war period. So very actively moving against cities, trying to incentivise growth elsewhere. And a big angle of this, particularly in the Barlow Commission on Dispersal of Industry, was about moving it away from London. What was the result? Well, London's population declined post-war and it continued to decline until 1986, which just so happens to be the year I was born, which is a coincidence, but perhaps not. Perhaps everybody else thought this was a great place to be. What this slightly jumbled pile of lines suggests is that in the late 1800s, London's GDP per head was rising off ahead of the rest of the country. And in the post-war years, this gap was narrowed, but it was narrowed primarily by bringing London, the line at the top, down. So London declines, and that's the only way we've achieved a slightly more balanced regional economy to date. It's not to say it's impossible, but that's been the experience of the past. But in recent decades, we've been talking, in recent years, but for at least a decade, we've been talking more and more about this issue again. Thatcher moved away from regional policy to some extent, used more local initiatives, things like enterprise zones or urban development corporations in particular places. New Labour, with its regional development agencies, tried to sort of grow everywhere. We've moved back towards perhaps more a local approach to dealing with this, but we're talking about it an awful lot. From the last three winning manifestos, this is why they're Conservative manifestos, talks about rebalancing the economy. Theresa May introduced an industrial strategy. Unfortunately, didn't last quite long enough to become a strategy. We're now talking about levelling up. So this has evolved very much, but it has a different nature to it. We haven't quite settled on a defined long-term one policy approach to achieving a more balanced economy across the country, although successive governments have agreed that it would be a good thing to do. What this very simple two lines shows is that since 1998, the gap has continued to grow, despite the fact that we are talking about it, and perhaps this is the reason why we are talking about it more. London's economic activity, GVA per head of population, has been shooting away, continuing to shoot away from the national average. There is something else going on. There's something else. There's another political, putting the economics to one side. There's a political element to this as well. London was on the losing side in the EU referendum. And this map here on the bottom left shows it's kind of swollen for population. So it shows how many people, a larger area reflects a larger population. And London looks like a kind of a boil on, I guess, the bum of Britain, which has been probably described as poor. But London did vote to remain by 60% to 40%, not all Londoners. But London and other big cities went one way and the rest of the country went another. And this introduces a new angle, a political angle, whereby perhaps London is seen as out of touch. It's seen as having a different set of values. I would argue the 2019 general election, which saw Conservatives win quite big in Leave seats, but Labour won the majority of Remain seats, has kind of just exaggerated or reinforced this trend. So levelling up seems a good idea, but it is a good idea in and of itself, but it has this extra element of being related to Brexit identities, wider cultural issues. Despite this, or perhaps because of this, levelling up has real good cut through. This is something that is reflected in some polling that some of my colleagues at the Policy Institute at King's found out in some recent polling, asking Brits which of the different types of inequality they think are the most serious in Britain. The top answer was inequalities between the more and less deprived areas of the UK, rather than perhaps people. Very surprised to see how the inequalities between older and younger generations finishes at the bottom there. But yes, this has real cut through. People feel that this is something that needs to be addressed. But it is also worth remembering, this cannot be emphasised enough, really, that London has its own communities that could also be described as left behind. Much of the talk around the EU referendum and its results focused on left behind communities, even if not all the communities that voted to leave the European Union were necessarily deprived communities. Some were more affluent. But London does have its own left behind. And what this graph on the right showed, I do like to show you graphs, is the difference that housing costs make to being poor or less affluent in London. Poverty rates go right up after housing costs. If you are in a lower income quartile in London, then after housing costs, and I would argue that housing is a necessity rather than a luxury, you need it. after those housing costs, you're actually worse off than in the rest of the country. This is not necessarily where the politics are leading us, where the electoral map is leading us, but there is great poverty in London, and those people should not be forgotten. Despite this, it is often portrayed as an out-of-touch place dominated by elites. Here is then Mayor Boris Johnson describing that very phenomenon.
Indeed, I noticed over the last few weeks and months of the recent campaign in Scotland, there was a slight note of not just of Anglophobia sometimes, but of Londonophobia in some of the rhetoric of our friends in the Scottish Nationalist Party. A suggestion that Londoners were culturally, politically, economically divorced from the rest of the country. And to listen to some of the London bashing, you might think that our capital was a modern Babylon, with billionaires being plied with hot towels on the top deck club class of their swanky new buses, or guzzling pearls dissolved in vinegar, while lolling back on the padded cushions of their Barclays hire bikes. And of course, I reject. Whilst I reject this rubbish, I would have to admit that one of the main reasons why I don't want this country to lurch back to Labour is that the current story of London is one of amazing success.
I'm going to say that I agree with the then Mayor and the current Prime Minister. An element of Londonophobia has perhaps grown ever since, and it's not confined, I disagree slightly that it's confined to Scotland. I think it's arguably growing elsewhere, perhaps including Westminster. A really tangled web of different reasons for people disliking our capital. People who don't like immigration, people who don't like cities in general, people who don't like elites or globalization, or even the young, all have reason to exhibit a little bit of what you could call perhaps Londonophobia. This can lead to quite loose talk about London and Londoners having a set of values and trying to impose those on the rest of the country. Londoners' values are perhaps in some areas, and polling suggests this, slightly different to the rest of the country, but only slightly. They're slightly more pro-migration, but they also have, London has higher proportions of graduates who tend to be more positive about immigration. It also has about a third of Londoners were born overseas. It's perhaps unsurprising, it would be slightly more receptive to the idea of migration, but it's not a different world. I disagree with this idea. Broadly speaking, Londoners' values and the rest of the UK's values are the same. And so, because I don't want to just be complaining about this, I thought I'd give you a couple of reasons to love London. Let's talk very positively for a moment. London, despite being portrayed on occasion as a different country, is a centre of our national life. We've got a picture here of the Cenotaph and Remembrance Sunday, big national moment of national importance, very patriotic moment. Centre of protest, whether those be the Black Lives Matter protests as pictured here, protests against violence against women, protests against lockdown, protests against particular football clubs' owners. These all occur in London. This is a big part of our national life. London is at the heart of the nation. It is not just, even though its economy might be quite similar to that of Paris and Tokyo and New York, it is very much, very identifiably an English and a British city. And this is illustrated there in this wonderful shot from the 2012 Olympics opening ceremony. Bit of cricket, bit of rain, there you go. That was a moment where the country really did seem to love its capital, if only for a brief moment. There are other reasons to love London, of course, and they're not all just about money. It is a magnet for global talent and investment, and the gateway to the world, draws in so much foreign direct investment that then some, not enough, but some does translate out, just trickle out to other parts of the UK. It's a global hub. It connects us to the world and it brings people in. But it also is a magnet for the nation's young and enterprising. I wouldn't say that every young person should move to London or should feel that they have to move to London. A more levelled up country where people could have all the opportunities and build the skills they need and access the employment they need anywhere in this country would be ideal. But equally, every young person should have the ability and the opportunity to come to London or one of our big cities and to meet other young people. All a city is a great agglomeration of people coming together to learn, to share ideas, to work productively, but also to meet one another. And there's nothing wrong with that. I'll put it as delicately as that. Despite all this and all that I've said so far, we have a lot of uncertainty about the future of London. We still are yet to see some of the economic impacts of Brexit, and particularly around financial services. The pandemic is far from over, and it has really hit central London in particular very hard. Levelling up, again, I cannot say enough, a very laudable aim, but it's yet to be defined, and there is a possibility that actually this is a shift of attention away from the capital and a shift of funding. If you look at things like London waiting for universities being removed recently, or the Levelling Up Fund, there is a reprioritisation at a time where London is facing a very uncertain future. And there is also an issue going on at the moment whereby it does look like, although who knows, I'm not in the predictions game and shouldn't be, but it does look like a Labour mayor is likely. London has become increasingly a Labour voting place. Could the Conservative Party become less interested in London, feel that it's a lost cause? Could the Labour Party feel that an association with London damages their brand to some extent? You know, they don't want to be seen as too London-centric. So incredibly uncertain times. And this is why I think it is time to make the case for why London's wonderful. To sum up, London gives much, much more than it takes, and its economy is crucial for the nation. Very important. And whilst elites tend to be Londoners, we've got a lot of billionaires, we've got a lot of political power based in the city, Londoners tend not to be elites. So when we're talking about London and Londoners, you need to remember this. Many Londoners are struggling too, are at more risk of being left behind than perhaps even some of the counterparts elsewhere in the country. Londoners might look different, we're much more diverse ethnically, religiously, might sound different, we speak more languages, and in recent times at least, vote differently, but values held in London are broadly the same as those in the rest of the country. Some good polling about, do you associate the Union Jack with patriotism and cross of St George? Londoners give the same sort of answers as the rest of the country. London is the UK's hub and connection to global Britain. Whatever global Britain is, this is our most internationalised, this is our gateway to the world, our most internationalised part of the country, and that is to be celebrated. But it is also, as I say, of its nation. Its continued success, far from guaranteed, and particularly after the pandemic, we really don't know what is to come, but we know that there are changes afoot. I don't believe in the death of the city theory, that nobody's going to need to be in the city centre anymore, but we are going to go through at least some turbulence. And so I think it is a good idea to be defending this place at the moment and saying, actually, it's really not that bad. And on that radical opinion, I will leave it there. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Jack. Very interesting. Catherine, over to you.
Great, thank you very much. And just very quickly, for those wondering, as policy chair, what on earth I am, I'm effectively the political leader of the City of London Corporation, the organisation which looks after the Square Mile, the area which was Londinium, you mentioned in the book, Jack. I'm an elected councillor, I represent the ward of Castle Baynard, that's Castle Baynard, not Barnard Castle, some get confused, which happens to be where Dr. Johnson's house is based. So quite a few connections to your book there, Jack. And can I just say that I think this is a really timely book, a really, really timely book, a very clear analysis of London's strengths, weaknesses and internal tensions at a really critical time for us all as we face the aftermath of the pandemic, an aftermath which is really hitting the central areas such as the City of London in ways that we would never have expected, as we face the aftermath of Brexit. and the changing nature of the business that can be carried out on our shores, and indeed our global standing. And as we face existential and accelerated questions about the future of cities generally. And actually, the future of cities is something which is very much front of mind at the City of London Corporation. Only today we have launched our own action plan for the next 5 years, Square Mile Future City, looking at what we should do at this really critical time to make sure that it regains its vibrancy as soon as possible. It retains its place as a world-leading business ecosystem, and we provide outstanding environments for those people, and I'll come back to people in a second, who are so vital to our existence. Jack, we did extensive consultation in the course of that to find out what people valued about London, and actually it was people that was the key denominator through everything. You know, people like the fact that they can do so much, such a range of business here, and that there's so many other things happening, but it's the people that was at the bottom line, the thing that ran through everything, and the access to people that they could work with. So actually, spoiler alert on our report, and I will put a link in the chat, it isn't about building more houses instead of offices. I very rarely take issue with the Financial Times, but I do today, I'm afraid. Anyway, for those of you expecting a respondent who's going to really challenge Jack and disagree with him, I'm afraid I won't, because I agree with your analysis, Jack. So if anybody wants a fierce debate, they better switch off now and watch something else. Because I agree with you, Jack, that London is, and it will remain, one of the world's greatest global cities. I agree with you that its relationship with the rest of the UK is very tense. I think its contribution is undervalued. There is a perception that we detract rather than add. And I particularly agree with you that we should all love London more. But I'd argue that what we need to do is to make the case better, not only make the case better for the partnerships that we have with the rest of the UK, but also prove that, show that, strengthen those relationships. And I also actually, going back to where I do agree with you, I agree that we need to change our tone. We haven't been humble in the past. That hasn't played us well in many different arenas, and we do need to look really at you know, how we step back from that a little bit. Incidentally, that's a message I also get when I'm talking about Brexit, which I don't plan to do any further. Just a few general thoughts first about London as a global city. And I think, as you say in your book, Jack, at the start of 2020, this really was, and I would say absolutely still is, one of the few, one of the world cities, one of the handful of world cities on Earth. And I will be speaking, because of our role in the city looking after the financial and professional services sector, I will be speaking particularly from that angle, which is, I accept, only part of what London is all about. But from a business perspective, we would absolutely agree. Benchmarking research that we carry out, we've carried out, really shows that businesses really prize what we have to offer, here for all the challenges that London also brings. Business carried out in London serves the world. It connects the world to financial and related professional services, to global capital markets. We're world leaders in insurance and in many other areas. We're leading the way on green finance, and how the financial sector can be a solution to the climate challenge. It's in London that some of the earliest green bonds have been listed, and we're leading the way in tech too. And that's actually an area where we have something very much in common with the rest of the UK. You've shown how London not only is a global city, but a great wealth generator for the UK. And I won't go into any other figures other than to point out when it comes to the business rate pool, that the city itself collects about 5% of the national overall take. And I think Westminster is about 9%. And that means that together, the two cities of Westminster and the city are phenomenal contributors to that particular pool. More than several big cities combined, actually. And that's another reason why the central activity zone really needs support to make sure that it bounces back, because it is a great contributor to the rest of the UK. So London is a generator of wealth, but it's also a global gateway to the whole of the UK. The exceptional international reach which we have does enable what your book terms spin-off investments to other cities and regions, and that role is more important now than ever. And that's actually not just, I would suggest, in the case of business. I mean, look at what happens with culture, where there are fantastic pockets and areas of cultural strength all around the UK. But what comes out of the West End is a great contributor to that and a great attractor of interest in the UK's offer. Look at tourism, where if people come to London, they're more likely to go out to other parts of England in particular. So we are a gateway beyond London itself. And the city and the financial and professional services sector more generally is also a critical enabler of international trade, not just for London, but for the rest of the UK. From the lawyers drafting the contracts to sell a product, the bankers providing letters of credit or other financing mechanisms, to the insurers covering transported goods. Financial and professional services firms and the expertise that we have in London has a vital role to play in helping other sectors across the UK navigate the international trading landscape. And we recently published a report that looks at this often overlooked role and explores ways for us to maximise the value of services for internationally trading firms, how we can help promote growth and jobs across the UK by helping navigate that framework. What I just want to flag, and perhaps should have flagged at the beginning, is that when I talk about the city, I don't just mean the contribution that we're making through London, but of course the financial and professional services sector, which carries our name, which is actually based outside London in more numbers than it is within, in places like Birmingham, Manchester and Glasgow, and well beyond. And so both that sector and London really have a central role to play in the UK's future success. I think your book, and incidentally, I was just going to show my copy of your book. I show some of the insights too. The problem is I've flagged up so much that I now can't reach the critical quote at the right moment, but there we are. Your book identifies some of the commonly held misconceptions about London. We're very clear that growth outside London doesn't and shouldn't come at the expense of London or vice versa. As you've rightly observed, this isn't a zero-sum game. A smaller London doesn't mean a larger Liverpool in any shape or form. It's really important that as we look forward, we look at how we can strengthen our links, build a more collaborative relationship so we can grow the size of the cake and then grow the size of the slices that people may receive. We're trying to play our own part in that through our partnership strategy, working with partners with common interests to ours on topics such as green finance and fintech, which I think have rightly been identified as important growth areas, green finance also being a vital solution to a critical problem. And we're trying to use with those partners, other key cities across the UK, we're trying to use the global reach, both of London and of the financial professional services sector, actively to highlight opportunities for inward investment across the UK to international investors. It's really clear, the more we speak with leaders of cities and areas around the UK, how many shared priorities we have, how many priorities in which financial and professional services can play an integral part. And let me take just two. Let me take, first of all, the question of skills, and particularly digital skills, a real priority for many cities, absolutely key to the UK's future competitiveness. It's very clear how many of us, and I include myself in this, will need to be reskilled to face some of the issues of the future. I mean, we've seen that great explosion in technology in running our daily lives, that real acceleration over the pandemic. It's clear that the world is changing very, very quickly, and we're going to need our skills to keep pace to meet that. We're pursuing that agenda with partners across the UK through our work, particularly with the Financial Services Skills Commission. So skills is one shared priority that I'd highlight. And another priority, of course, is the challenge of the climate change, the need for climate action. So we're also working with regional partners, looking at how we can use the city's financial expertise to promote green growth across the regions and nations, how we can help connect strong clusters of sustainable businesses which exist around the UK to the global capital markets, and really how we can help boost regional economies as well as working on maintaining London's place as a key global city. As we do that, it's important not only that we look at inequalities between regions, but that we look at inequalities within regions. And Jack, I completely agree with you that London has its significant needs too, that we have, as you say in your book, as you quote in your book, we basically have a very rich city and a very poor city sitting side by side. So I always make the case for London's needs as well when we're talking about the levelling up agenda. But just to summarise, I think our focus needs to be on collaboration, on partnership, and on learning from each other, using, and we will be seeking to use our voice to help promote growth across the whole of the UK. It's absolutely more crucial than ever that we focus on what we can do to keep London strong, but also to keep London working for the rest of the UK and strengthening its links. So thank you again for a fascinating book. I really enjoyed reading it, and I'm looking forward to hearing you answer the many questions which I hope are pouring in.
Thank you so much. Okay, yes, we'll move to Q&A now. Do put your questions in the functionality on Zoom. First question from Simon Girdleston from the Treasury, who asks, isn't the cultural divide point between London and the rest of the country something that has always happened since the city was founded by the Romans? London supported the Reformation in the 16th century, Parliament in the 17th century, and radicalism in the 18th and 19th centuries. Aren't big cities naturally associated with the latest international ideas than other more rural or less well-connected areas?
Wow, so Simon has started with the Romans, which I do in the book, but there is something in that. I go back to kind of Elizabeth I, James I, both talking about the expansion of London and a big fear that the sort of irrepressible growth of the city is going to lead to the destruction of the countryside. So I guess to some extent there's a kind of a cultural thing from the very beginning there. I mean, to some extent, I guess this is a cities, there is a kind of cities versus the rest issue here, and it's reflected in a lot of political events in recent elections in several other countries. If you look at the kind of the debate around victories for Trump, victories for Brexit, there's a strong sort of rural-urban element. And this is a kind of a common theme, but I think there are times in history where this issue is less prominent, and there's times where it is more prominent. And I think at the moment it is a particular type of anti-Londonism. Of course, there is a kind of cities are not for everybody, and that's absolutely fine. And there's always this slight tension between the needs of both cities and less densely populated areas. But I think there is something particular about London at the moment. Some of this relates to wider events with Brexit and wider the way that we're thinking about different regions. Some of it relates to immigration, which is a more, perhaps the scale is a more recent phenomenon. There are more contemporary issues, and it's certainly the way that Brexit drew attention to what we call left behind areas, which is quite a kind of catch-all term, but quite often we're talking here about sort of ex-industrial towns, places where there was industry and now there isn't, and we haven't worked out how to help build up those new economies. So there is a kind of, there's an eternal London, the rest of the UK thing, but then there are more contemporary issues. And I think those contemporary issues potentially risk mixing up sort of the policy with some of the politics, some of the rhetoric, and that's at the heart of what the book talks about.
Following up that question, James Leahy, Jim from Ottawa, asks, what impact do you foresee from Brexit? Will it impact London more or less than the rest of the UK?
Well, it's a really good question, and it's also a crystal ball question to some extent. Even though we have now left the European Union, so I'm nervous about making predictions. The Treasury's own estimates beforehand, right? They tried to work out the regional impact of Brexit before it was delivered, and it was expected that it would hit London less. Ultimately, that it would be more damaging to the economies of the regions. Terrible phrase, the regions, but you see what I mean. It's really kind of, it's too soon to say, but it does seem likely that if Brexit does lead to something negative for the economy, if it does mean that we take a bit of a hit, even in the short term, which seems likely and reasonable to expect, that there will be less money available to do the things that this government has talked about with the levelling up agenda, which is big investment in transport elsewhere, big investment in skills. So if we do see, even if London does relatively well after Brexit, and that's very uncertain, if the country doesn't do quite so well, there will be less money to address these regional inequalities. So I'm slightly concerned about the impact of Brexit on the whole levelling up agenda. But obviously, relentlessly optimistic, just in general, about everything.
Thank you. Richard Brown asks, London and the rest of the UK shouldn't be a zero-sum game, but public and private sector investment sometimes is. Are there ways of supporting other regions which don't do London down?
Yes, absolutely. I would argue it doesn't. Public sector investment does not necessarily always need to be a zero-sum game, and I mentioned earlier the London waiting issue with universities. Just because this is something that's on my mind, universities not the only thing out there. But this was a case of what was being proposed was removing the London waiting, putting it elsewhere. Very much a zero-sum approach. And I do think that if that's one of your priorities, universities and skills, then levelling up would mean increasing funding elsewhere rather than bringing funding down in the capital in order to do so. So it doesn't need to be a zero-sum game. I think that's true of infrastructure as well. But of course, there are some areas where private sector investment is going to go London or it's not. I would generally argue that London is competing with other world cities rather than competing with other parts of the UK. And so bringing investment in to the capital is generally good for the rest of the country as opposed to it going elsewhere. But there are things that can be done as well. And I think there's some good working between cities, particularly between city regions. Something that's just come into my mind that we talked about when I did this report for Centre for London was London partners working with Greater Manchester, for example, and offering holiday packages that visit both cities. And I think that, you fly into London, then you go to Manchester, then you fly out from there. It's a package deal. I think there is something similar that could be offered with foreign direct investment in general, right? Some of it comes into London and spills off outside. Once a business is settled, it then spreads out. I think that there's work to be done on this, and the network of mayors that we have around the country now, there are local leaders in charge. Heseltine very, very keen on this idea that someone needs to be in charge. If you want to sort something out, put someone in charge. Show me who's in charge. There are these local leaders now. There may be more to come. They may be strengthened over time. But that's the role that they can play collectively, working together. Where are the linkages? How can we strengthen them?
John Hall, good evening, John, asks, two intriguing presentations, thank you both. The collaboration point, what are the possible ways of prosecuting collaboration given the political palette of red, blue, blue, red, in relation to, for example, education and training and also the arts?
Wow. I think I broadly follow the question. In all areas of policy, I guess education and the arts being two, there is an issue here, particularly around London and the rest of the UK, because London is governed by, London-wide government is run by currently a Labour mayor and national government is run by a Conservative mayor. And so if we're talking about red-blue in that sense, which I assume we are, collaboration is difficult. The mayor has some powers and does not have other powers, and is actually very reliant, the Mayoralty is very reliant on working well with whoever's in power. So it's a difficult time for the capital at the moment, and it could continue to be so. I'm sure that they can find creative ways to work together. I know I'm talking in very general sense at the moment, but I'm sure that it needs to be a priority. We need to find ways behind the scenes to ensure that if it is a Labour mayor and a Conservative government, as would be the case if it was a Conservative government and a Labour mayor, that they are working together to ensure that we get the investment and help that we need.
Okay, I've got Tom here, and then I'd like to bring in Catherine. Tom Robinson, our great Strand Group friend, sitting here rather dichotomously, as both a proud Mancunian who resides in Manchester, but also a long-standing freeman of the city who is regularly present in the city too. I very much appreciated Catherine's talk of more collaborative ventures between the corporation and the regions. What are the specific challenges to successfully achieving this over the coming years in the eyes of the panel?
Catherine, would you like to take that one?
Shall I start with that? And actually, shall I just say I suggest Tom is a typical Londoner, because you can be both a Mancunian and a Londoner. I was speaking to someone the other day who described themselves as a proud London Scot, and we could spend hours talking about our nationalities, but I think that's typical of London, isn't it? We've got both people who go back generations and people who are proud to be Londoners with other allegiances. I think when we talk about the partnerships with other cities and other areas, and I'll just speak from our perspective and our experience, I think that business has a big part to play as well. Yes, city-to-city links at the political level are really important, but business playing its part too, I think, is really important. We ourselves, with we're slightly odd. We are a political organisation in the sense that we're elected, but we're non-denominational, and that makes it, we're non-party political, that makes it perhaps easier. We forge our links both city to city and also with our business colleagues. So TheCityUK, which has a network of city chairs. I think having a clear agenda around what you can achieve together and being realistic, so looking for really shared opportunities, areas where you do both have something tangible to work on. And I think also being very clear that you can be collaborators as well as being competitors at the same time. And this is a message we're trying to pass at the moment to some of our EU counterparts as well. Just because you're not part of, just because you're competing on some fronts doesn't mean you can't work together on others. I'm like you, Jack, I'm an eternal optimist. At the moment, we're finding our partnerships are going from strength to strength. We're finding more and more to do with those cities that we're working with. We have been visiting a lot of them for years, but we've been much more structured now and strategic around the way we're connecting. And I'm an optimist, so I see opportunity rather than obstacle at the moment. You're absolutely right about our key competitors for London being global. We've seen that with business heading to New York, if it has moved at all, and that just takes me. I said I wouldn't talk about Brexit. I think for both London and the rest of the country, the impact of Brexit really depends on what we do next. We're out of Europe. It may be, many of us may feel that's very sad, but we're out of Europe. We need out of the EU, not out of Europe. That won't happen. We now need to look at what we do next, have an ambition for our country and build on it. And that's why I'm very pleased to see some of the support that's being put behind the tech recommendations of the recent Khalifa review, for instance, to get back into my professional services and financial services space. Jack, what's the academic answer?
I'm not going to do the academic answer. I'm afraid I'm going to build on Tom's point about having a dual citizenship. Although he didn't put it quite that way. I think the London identity is very easily acquired. I think there's been plenty of research done on this, and it's a very inclusive identity. It can, apparently, according to Tom, and I think according to many others, be held simultaneously with others, with other forms of identity, and it is a very inclusive thing. Something I didn't really mention there is that London's population has grown for a while, because of numbers of births exceeding numbers of deaths, and because of more people migrating in from other countries than leave. But there's a huge churn, constant churn. More people move out of London to the rest of the UK than move from the rest of the UK into London. So that's not what's driving the growth, but it's big numbers. It's much bigger numbers every year. This is a really key and important point, is that London's borders, just like its identity, are porous. You know, this is very much Londoners are of the country as well, and you can be a Londoner for a while and then move on, and that's fine. And so I think some of the way that we discuss London and Londoners and their values needs to take into account the fact that actually for some people, they are from somewhere else in the UK. They might end up somewhere else in the UK, and that is fine as well. And so I just build on that point rather than giving you a slightly more boring one. Although perhaps that was boring as well.
Okay, Diana Beach, CEO of London Hire, asks, thanks for a great session. I look forward to reading the book. Have we pushed the notion of London as a thriving global city to the detriment of a more disadvantaged local London? How can we strike a balance to tell the tale of the two cities?
I mean, it's an incredibly difficult thing to do, because it's very important. I'm thinking, if you're the mayor of London, okay, if you're in charge of the city, to some extent, you're the political leader of the whole city, small C city, Catherine being leader of the big C city. Your job is to ensure, as we said, London is competing with other global cities, to go around the world and say, invest here, come here, visit London, study in London. This is a great place to do global business, and this is a great place to visit from around the world. And so you really have to talk up London's global city aspects. And in talking up, in talking that up, you can engage in a little bit of London is the best place in the world, which I think is a perfectly decent thing to say, and certainly is an important thing to say around the world. But that can sound a little bit like you are gloating at home, and that breeds some resentment. It's also quite hard to find space to talk about London's local communities and London's poorer communities, and particularly to do so without sounding like you are complaining, or to have that dual narrative is inherently quite difficult to say that this is a place where both things are true, even though it is a fact. And so I think it is difficult, and I think it is, but it's a question of tone, because both things can be true, and we have to deal with complexity. Policymakers have to deal with complexity. The public has to deal with complexity. You know, we have to realise that, you know, both things can be true and are true. It's a difficult thing to communicate, but it is a very important thing to communicate. And I like that point about local London, because this is so, you know, this is what speaks to me, my experience growing up, where I grew up in outer London. You know, we went uptown. It was a thing. It was a trip into the centre. Some people that I grew up with wouldn't have gone into central London. And so there's many people's experiences of growing up in this city. They can feel as isolated from power, from Westminster, or even from the city, as people growing up elsewhere in the country. I think that's an important point that needs to be made.
You'll remember Peggy Mitchell used to always say about going up west. I remember that. Tony Travers, good evening, Tony, asks, are London politicians actually slightly afraid to defend London? Scottish and Northern Ireland politicians fight hard for their nations and never apologise for any failures there. Groups of MPs from the rest of England, notably the New Northern Research Group, fight hard for more resources, even if it is at London's expense. London MPs rarely work together on the city's behalf. Even London's elected local leaders appear to feel the need to apologise for the city's success and its diversity. Has the time come for London to be a little more assertive in its own defence, at least to make the counterfactual case about how the rest of the UK is unlikely to succeed if London-wider southeast population 22 million out of UK 66 million were pushed into a comforting spiral of decline?
Wow, what a question. I mean, no, I personally, I would agree. I'm not trying to have a go at any particular politician, but it is the job of let's say, Andy Burnham to advocate, because Tom was here a minute ago, to advocate for Greater Manchester and to make the case and to say we need a better share of the better piece of the pie, bigger piece of the pie. We need our voices listened to. And this is one of the things that happens with devolution, with having strong local leaders, is that you have people who are advocating for their region. I do think that the tone has changed quite recently around London, actually. And I think that London, under the Mayor Johnson, not particularly blaming him, but I'm talking about the timeline, the chronology, where we were in London's development and its relationship, tended to talk about invest in London, build some new trains, build a new train line in London, and people in Derby will build them for us. You should be grateful. And the tone was, there's truth in that. Investing in London leads the rest of the country to grow. But the tone did feel a bit like, I don't know if anybody else watches films that are quite so aimed at the young as me, but Hunger Games, like it was all about serving the capital. And that rhetoric, I think, landed quite badly at times. But then we became a little bit apologetic, I think, as a city, a little bit apologetic, and things have turned since. And some of this is about Brexit and identity, and some of this is about the electoral map shifting about a little bit. But I do think that London's MPs, London's voices, various voices, business voices as well, probably do need to be a little bit more assertive now, because we have moved into another phase. Ever since I did the report for Centre for London 2 years ago, and in that time, I do think we have turned up the notch a little bit on pitting regions against each other, on anti-Londonism, on describing your opponents as London elites, metropolitan elites, North London elites specifically. And as the tone changes, as the political imperatives change, as the electoral map changes, there's a potential that focus shifts elsewhere. And therefore, it is a time for London's MPs to work perhaps together in a way they haven't before. I would tend to agree with Tony's question, which I'm sure will shock you.
Nick Bowes, Mayoral Director of Policy, asks, the country is increasingly fragmented, old versus young, Brexiters, he says Brexiteers, I say Brexiter, versus Remainers, city versus rural, Scotland versus the rest, metropolitan liberal elite versus more socially conservative, etc. So how much do you think the recent rise of anti-London sentiment is actually a symptom of the wider crumbling of the UK? Are the things we have in common enough to continue to hold us together as a nation?
I mean, it's another very good question. I mean, I describe in the book, and I can't claim to have got to the bottom of this, but several different threads of division, different types of divisions within the country that have become tangled up, and that leads to this anti-Londonism. I don't think it's necessarily, for some people, about the capital, about the place. It's not necessarily about the city or Westminster or any particular aspect. There are so many, as Nick rightly points out, so many divisions. I think the generational one is quite important as well. Londoners do tend to be younger, even though there are growing numbers of older Londoners as well. Cities do tend to attract the young, there's more graduates. And so it becomes a kind of a byword for all these various different things. Nick mentioned Scotland. There's obviously a kind of climate, a broader climate of fragmentation and a potential for the ending rather than the deepening of unions of various kinds. And I'm just instinctively, quite deeply feel that unions are a good thing, and that not dividing is a good thing. And so I really hope that, to return to Tony's question really, that we can kind of organise in some way a more collective and more inclusive way of talking about why this place and its people are the same as, and we have more in common than we have that divides us, because I think that is actually true. I think that there are a lot of different divisions that we can focus on. I think that fundamentally people want the same things. And fundamentally, our economies are completely intertwined, city in London and the rest of the country. And so it's actually a lot of these divisions, I don't think are actually irretractable, and perhaps I am just being optimistic here, but I don't think there is an inevitable decline either of London or the rest of the UK economically, or in the strength of the bonds that tie us together.
Thanks. Okay, Tony Travers is after you, and I can't resist it. To go one step further, unemployment in London is now by far the highest in the UK, 7.2%. Is that a good thing or a bad thing for the UK?
When you say he's after me, do you mean he's blaming me personally for that? Because I don't think it'd be fair to say that it's my fault. It's obviously, for me, a bad thing. Just a radical personal opinion, unemployment, not good. I can see, I guess, what he's getting at in terms of rebalancing, in terms of the particular sectors, perhaps. There is nothing good really to say about unemployment. This is a very sad thing. And we will see, I guess, in the months and years to come, to what extent London's economy can kind of bounce back. I think a lot of people seem to have left. There's differing estimates as to how much London's population has dropped by. I don't think we've got really good data on this, both in terms of people leaving the country during the pandemic and people leaving the city to, students return to their parents' houses, even sort of young graduates return to their parents' houses elsewhere. There is potential that we're going to have a lot less people and a lot less jobs, and neither of those things, I think, are a good thing. I don't think that necessarily leads to growth elsewhere in the UK. I don't think there is an obvious link there. I don't think that people losing their jobs means that they'll go and get jobs elsewhere and start up a brand new centre of growth in the UK. So I disagree with Tony's question, and I don't know what he was expecting from me really.
Tony wants to make it clear that he doesn't think it's your fault. Okay, so I just want to put that.
Okay,
right,
and I assume he's okay with me being broadly anti-unemployment as well.
Gaurav Chowdhury asks, and there's several points from others, housing and asset prices in general have materially increased post-pandemic. Any thoughts on the demand for land in major cities, including but not limited to London, in light of real estate trends coupled with tech enabling work from home? Dare I say it, there's sort of like, another element, another dimension to this. The Strain Group's Jan Gokchan asks, to what extent is affordable housing to buy as well as to rent the key to unlocking London's opportunities for young people in the long term? So I think you've got, commercial aspects there, you've got residential, so basically property.
Yeah, again, we're into the predictions territory, but I mean, I think what is clear is that not many people really genuinely said cities are done. But some people did. Some people did say, well, we've been talking for years about the fact that we can work remotely. Won't people rather live by the sea and work remotely and not live in cities anymore? That didn't happen. And then pandemic really accelerated the trend of remote working. And this ties to the demand to be close to a city. But I think that ultimately, you're still going to see people wanting to have that access. If we go to, I'm not the only person saying this, some sort of flexible working seems more likely. People are going to be spending 2 or 3 days in the office, and businesses are therefore going to want to be in the city centre. And so we're going to continue to need to provide more affordable housing so that we can keep people within reach. You don't have to be in the middle of the city, and maybe there will be some opportunities for some more housing in London and in central London even. But actually, businesses will probably come back as well. We'll still have the same sort of pressures. I think it's very likely we're still going to be facing the same sort of housing pressures. And so building more, very important. In terms of prices, I'm not going to give any sort of guidance that's going to lead to anyone making any investments anywhere. But I do think that London will bounce back, and with it, demand for both housing and commercial property. I think that feels almost inevitable, but it could be harmed by a lack of investment and a lack of focus from central government.
David Williams asks, isn't the real issue that what we class as left behind are actually not London versus everywhere else, but actually urban versus rural? Having lived in Bristol, the same arguments being used against London are used by people from Weston-super-Mare against Bristol. Isn't the real problem that success breeds success, and that people move away from failing places are often the most skilled in that area? We see the same argument between Exeter and the rest of Devon. Urban area import and concentrates the skills better than smaller market towns, and what London has shown is they've reduced deprivation by what is good management. I mean, I'd follow up a much, David's going very specifically sort of like regional there, local. I mean, for me, isn't the dislike of London simply an anti-capital phenomenon seen across the world? There must be a huge element of this to this particular story.
I think that definitely people who don't like capitalism and globalization will be anti-capital city as well, and that's a coincidence really with the wording. But I mean, these are problems. The anti-capital city experience phenomenon is shared in many other nations as well, particularly ones that are not federal, so they have one capital city and becomes seen as overmighty and getting more than its fair share of investment. This is not something that's just happening in the UK. I remember going to Boston in Lincoln when I was writing the report with Centre for London, and went there as it's the highest leave vote in the country, very much rural, and they talked there about how people, they really hate Lincoln. Lincoln's seen as the London of that particular part of the east of England. And so there's an inevitability that people will resent cities if cities are not for them. And that's okay, because cities are not for everybody, even though we are becoming increasingly urbanized and cities have incredible benefits economically, culturally. I'm a fan. I've lived in the same one all of my life. But that's okay. It's inevitable to have some resentment towards the big city that gets all the investment and is a dirty and horrible place full of people, particularly if you don't like people. There's that element as well. Some people don't like capital. Some people just don't like people very much. And so they'd rather live away from people. And that is absolutely fine as well. But yeah, it's natural, it's inevitable, but there are particular, as I say again, there are particular elements at the moment to do with our politics and to do with perhaps some of our discourse that have made this particularly relevant, particularly pointed at the moment. And that's what the book's about.
Okay, a very last question here. If personally I've got one criticism of the book, it's a bit too pro-Arsenal. And Professor Mark White of Queen Mary asks, regarding our greatest national sport, European Cups, I think he's given away his age there, won by football teams outside of London are 12. European Cups won by London teams, 1. How does one account for this difference? Saying, I'm an enormous fan of London, I hasten to add. I think it's fair to say that we could be, in a year's time, talking about West Ham actually winning the Champions League, right? I mean, it's still possible. Anyway, Jack, over to you.
It's not possible. And how to account for that? How to account for that? It's one example, the success of football teams, where I think actually the kind of the regional situation is almost inverse, right? Isn't it? It's London clubs do not dominate, although there are some very successful and arguably the greatest team the world has ever seen is a London club. But yes, it is interesting. It is interesting. What's also interesting, though, I guess regionally, if we're talking about football, is I wonder if there's an element of the difficulty that Newcastle and Sunderland have perhaps had, being a little bit more remote. Manchester's a very successful, Liverpool very successful. Northeast, perhaps a little bit further out. Maybe it's harder to get players out there. I've no idea. I mean, I don't think Mark's question is entirely serious. Perhaps I'm wrong, and I apologise, Mark, if you wanted a deep and meaningful answer to this. But it is worth mentioning as well that the national sports teams, so many national sports stadiums, sports events in the capital as well, just to try and underline that point that London is perhaps, you know, culturally of its nation as well as its own, in its own right.
I tried to finish on something a bit jovial. I mean, in parentheses, Arsenal are 10th at the moment. But our old friend Stephen Hammond, MP for Wimbledon, has come in late, so I think we've got to include him. Jack and Catherine have said London is a global city and that benefits the UK. Do they think that the internal UK anti-London sentiment will affect the international perception? And if you want politicians to unite for London, what do we need to do?
I'll give Catherine a moment. I'd love to hear her thoughts if she's happy to answer that. But I mean, I've seen some surveys of highly mobile workers, highly skilled workers from around the world that suggest that London's reputation had, to some extent, decoupled from that of the UK. So if national government and things like Brexit were perceived as being perhaps less welcoming to the world, London's reputation remains that of a very international city. The London is Open campaign being one example of many ways in which the city is going around the world and selling itself as a real global asset. So in that respect, I think London's going to be okay. I think where we probably need a little bit of work as London MPs, and this is, you know, far be it for me to tell an MP how to do his job, but I would be talking quite loudly at the moment about how important London is to the rest of the UK's economy, and that's the message we need to get out there, that actually the money comes in through London, but it is redistributed around the country, and that this is a perfectly good thing. This is a positive thing, and it's not just a gateway to the world. It's somewhere where, through being so international, it benefits the whole of the UK. But I'd love to talk to Stephen more about that on another occasion. Catherine, do you have any comments?
Thank you very much, Jack. Just very quickly, I would think that what we say, what internal tensions there are in the country against London probably doesn't impact on our standing overseas, but what we say on the international stage does, whether that's the attitude that we send out, the impression we send out about our openness to people from other countries. So our migration policy is really critical, whether it's our the message we send out about London's openness and the rest of the UK's openness to trade, whether it's the message we send out about some of our core strengths, like, dare I say it, the rule of law, and whether we're going to comply with it. So I think there's a big onus on all of us who have anything to do on the international stage not to undermine those core strengths. What can politicians do to support London better? I actually think the pandemic, there have been one or two silver linings, and one thing that I've seen is the fantastic way that politicians of all levels in London, local government in particular, actually, but have come together. So you've got the boroughs and the city and City Hall working really well together and working really well together with ministers. It would be great to see that continue, and also to see the piece that Tony was raising, the idea of getting the London MPs perhaps to work as a more cohesive group advocating for London. Because, Jack, I think your excellent book, which I will just finish by saying everybody should go and buy, it absolutely makes a crucial point that this is a time when we need to love London more, and who better to do that than London's elected representatives. We absolutely should be working together to do what we can.
Okay, I think that draws us to a close. Thank you so much. Thank you to wonderful questions from the audience. Thank you so much, Catherine, for joining us. And well done, Jack. Buy the book. Buy the book. It's cheap. Buy the book. See you next time. Thank you.